and myself. Good morning. I'm State Senator Susie Oppenheimer from Westchester County, and I'm chair of the Senate Democratic Task Force on Women's Issues, along with Assemblywoman Helene Weinstein, chair of the Assembly Task Force on Women's Issues, and Assemblywoman Kathy Nolan, who we expect momentarily, chair of the Women's Legislative Caucus. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this joint public hearing on women and the budget. We're here today to talk about the impact of the proposed 1991-92 budget on the women of New York State. New York is in the midst of a severe, I don't have to tell you, fiscal crunch. The state budget deficit could grow as high as $7 billion. In fact, from the information we hear this morning, it's about $500 million up from where we thought. In order to balance the state budget, spending has to be reduced. The executive budget calls for the complete elimination of some programs for women and deep cuts in many of the remaining programs. In addition, the budget calls for the consolidation of programs and services which affect women. No one, including the governor, is happy with the proposed cuts. We all need to work together to develop a budget that preserves essential services for women. So we are here today to hear from those agencies and advocates who will be most affected by these cuts. How will these cuts affect services for women? Which services will be the hardest hit? The public needs to be aware of what a tight budget means to these services. We're not here to foster illusions about this year's budget. We in the legislature will reassert our own priorities. At the same time, we are all aware that this year our ability to do that through massive funding restorations is going to be extremely limited. We are also here today to talk about the long-range ramifications of this budget process. Many programs are going to be cut. Can these programs be restructured or streamlined to provide services more efficiently and cost-effectively? We want to hear how we can better serve the women of the state of New York, and we're delighted you're here to tell us how we can best help you in these extremely tight times. Helene, you want to say a few words?
Being a little taller than Susie, I'll sit down.
We're almost the same height when she sits and I stand.
I just want to say that it's a pleasure to welcome people here today. For many months, my office has been struggling with the proposed budget and trying to deal with programs for women in the context of the budget that provides very few dollars, prevents us from going forward with new initiatives and trying to figure out how we can save as many programs that we have all in this room worked very hard for over the years. So I'm looking forward to hearing from people and from some of the people we've worked with over the years and hearing some of your ideas, not only what's important, I think a lot of us know what's important, but some of the impact of what these proposed cuts will have and perhaps ways that we can provide the same services with while cutting back on dollars. I'm sure some of our other colleagues will join us as we go along. Susie, did you want to introduce?
Yes, and now Tony Masiello, Senator Masiello, who has just started up a new task force on child care in the 2000 century. Tony, you want to say a few words?
Well, it's certainly a pleasure to be part of this task force. Senator Oppenheimer, I thank you for inviting me. The last several years as the ranking member of the Senate Committee on Daycare, myself along with Senator Oppenheimer and others have been in the forefront of trying to increase the availability, the accessibility, and the affordability of daycare for the working women in our state. We feel very good about some of the progress that we have made. However, much more has to be done. Just recently I put together a special task force in the Senate dealing with the state of daycare as we enter the new century, how much of a demand there will be for daycare, what the state will be able to provide to try to enhance the availability of daycare. And we're looking forward to working not only with all of you in this room, but also many of your organizations and your friends in trying to determine the extent of the need and what we at the state level should be doing in addressing that need. So while I'm very happy to be part of this joint effort with Senator Oppenheimer and other legislators from the Senate and the Assembly, I guess I'm serving a dual role of also as a ranking member of the Senate Child Care Committee, reaching out to all of you to find out what we can be doing in the area of daycare also. So I'm pleased to be here this morning and looking forward to working with you.
Okay, let's get right down to the business. First, we'd like to hear from Kelly Marie Best, Director of the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Thank you, Kelly. We have your statement up here.
Honorable Senator Oppenheimer, Honorable Assemblywoman Weinstein, and esteemed members of the
Put the mic closer to your mouth and you can't hear you.
Closer, okay.
Thanks.
All right. Honorable Senator Oppenheimer, Honorable Assemblywoman Weinstein, and esteemed members of the legislative. I wish to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak before you today on the issues of budgeting for sexual assault programs. I speak as the director of the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. The New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault represents a majority of all the rape crisis centers, survivors, mental and medical health professionals across the state, as well as legal professionals and interested individuals. Prior to the position I now hold, I was a volunteer with the Schenectady Rape Crisis Program for 5 years and a volunteer and board member of the New York State Coalition for 3 years. On July 19, 1989, Governor Cuomo signed an executive order number 126 establishing a task force on rape and sexual assault to investigate the adequacies of the current laws, the adequacies of counseling and support services for victims, the handling of the cases in the criminal justice system, the public attitudes, the availability of treatment for sex offenders. When the final report was released in April of 1990, there were some very clear statements regarding the needs of survivor services in the state. There remains the myths, the cultural and sexual attitudes, the denials of the reality of the heinous crime, and the long-term consequences that will affect all citizens of the state of New York. Rape is about violence, power, control, not only sex, or not sex, not about sex. It's robbery that cannot be reimbursed. The shame and guilt that comes with being a victim is never outgrown. Continued support in the lives of survivors is vital. How does a 5-year-old seek and find support? This statement was taken right from the governor's own task force on rape and sexual assault report. It was done by one of the people who participated in one of the focus meetings. As the proposed budget now stands, the majority of rape crisis centers report proposed combined funding cuts between 40 to 60%. In most cases, these centers are already working with one staff or a part-time staff person. Last year, the majority of these centers only received $18,300 for complete operational staffing cost. Although some of these centers do receive New York State crime victims money, many of them don't. During the time of fiscal uncertainty, even private foundations and corporate grant monies are deteriorating. New York City has only one rape crisis program left that provides comprehensive services. And we foresee, with these cuts, more programs closing across the state. In 1981, the passage of the ominous Reconciliation Act, the Federal Prevention Health Block Grant allocated each state based on population funds for rape crisis services and prevention programs. The New York State Department of Health was identified as the principal conduit for these federal monies. In fiscal year 1985-86, the New York State Legislature added an additional $500,000 to the federal funds. In 1986 and 87, the governor included in his budget another $500,000, and this was matched by the legislature for a total of $1 million. This amount has remained the same until 1988-89, when the legislature increased the allotment for rape crisis centers by $50,000 for a total of $1,050,000. Since fiscal year 1988-89, this sum has remained the same, resulting in a slow erosion of the services over the last few years. Rape crisis centers have been in existence for almost 2 decades in New York State, and as yet still have had no stable means of fiscal support to ensure the services from year to year. The proposed cuts back in funding for the rape crisis centers on the top of the funding erosion will have a devastating effect on the future of all New York State citizens. As the governor's own task force report points out, quote, research indicates that violent crime creates a long-lasting medical impact on the victim. If the service delivery system is able to provide an immediate, coordinated response to meet the needs of the victims of sexual assault, it is more likely that these victims will recover and return to pre-victimization health status, and we will begin to mitigate the spiraling cost in human lives and in real dollars that the unresolved trauma creates. Unquote. The rippling effect of the unresolved trauma will eventually cost taxpayers of the state thousands and thousands of dollars when a person and their family or support system become unable to take control of their lives, and they become dependent then upon the mental health care system due to the debilitating and the long-lasting effects which may not surface for some time. Rape crisis centers across New York State serve a unique group of crime victims with highly specific needs. These victims require immediate intervention, continued advocacy, and emotional support, and in many cases, long-term therapeutic assistance. During the last grant cycle, we aided 9,644 new victims. 27% of these were children, or their parents, their husbands, their boyfriends, their significant others. Another 23,406 people received information or telephone assistance through our hotline phone contact. This number represents a 98% increase over the past year. These are real people. They're not just numbers. The majority of New York's 72 rape crisis centers are already working on a shoestring budget. With rent and utility, as well as other essential costs increasing annually, they can no longer trim their operational budgets. There's nothing left to trim. Most centers report that if funding is at least not maintained at the 1990-91 level, preventive educational services will be abandoned. For the basic fact that the first priority of any crisis program is to provide the crisis intervention and the advocacy services to the victim of sexual assault. The tragedy here is that research has shown that preventive education is one of the only ways to stop the cycle of sexual violence. For example, rape crisis centers have invested many years developing and updating educational information to help prevent the potential victimization of children. These programs not only focus on teaching good touch and bad touch, they also teach our youth about self-esteem, communication skills, development of assertiveness, and decision-making abilities, as well as creating all social awareness. What is crucial to understand is that teaching these elements assist and empower our children to both identify and report abuse as it happens. Not only is it essential to offer these programs, but we must continue them on an ongoing basis to allow our children to maintain and reinforce the concepts and behavioral skills needed to keep them safe through their lives. Rape on college campuses across the states has been a well-hidden secret for too long. Rape by strangers doesn't occur only in a large urban area or in a dark alley. Women have been raped by strangers in their own homes, in their own beds. Women today still continuously are raped by their husbands. They've never heard of the Liberta decision overturning the New York State marital rape exemption rule. Centers have developed specific programs to address these myths and stereotypes that are still prominent in today's society. Problems of gender, racial, culture, and ethnic stereotyping also have a broad effect on sexual assault cases, and centers must continue to educate the adult population. Even at present funding levels, however, rape crisis centers are not able to meet the continued demand for such prevention-oriented programming. In the past week alone, some centers have reported that they can not only no longer afford to offer these programs, but have begun to lay off paid educators and other support staff, as well as to eliminate the prevention programming. These centers have provided its community, its schools and colleges with preventive education in hopes of combating the societal myths regarding sexual assault. From October of 1989 to September of 1990, centers across the state provided 165,022 people with this preventive education. 113,332 of those people were children. Governor Cuomo called for greater public education in the state address last year, and the task force he created acknowledged the need for such services. Many of our clients were sexually abused as children, and without the preventative education and intervention, they may too continue the cycle of sexual assault. It has been estimated that a child molester will abuse 100 children before there is a disclosure and legal intervention. How many of these children will act out their anger through drugs, through prostitution, or continue the cycle of sexual assault in the future? How many will grow up with severe emotional handicaps? The long-term consequences of the failure to serve this population will appear before us in the mental and criminal populations of our future. Historically, it has been the case that the understaffed rape crisis centers have still been able to offer and maintain quality services to their community through the efforts of dedicated volunteers. Hundreds of New York State citizens volunteer tens of thousands of hours each year to these programs. It is reported that there is an average of approximately 16 volunteers per center through our state. They have provided approximately 85% of the 24-hour hotline coverage rendered through the centers 365 days a year. They have provided approximately 80% of all the crisis intervention and approximately 85% of all the medical and legal advocacy, and around 40% of the prevention services. How much more can we ask of our volunteers? In order to do these things, rape crisis volunteers need to be trained by a professional staff. Their work needs to be monitored. They must be provided with an organized, structured system to work within. They are dealing with a person's most innermost emotional framework. Their compassion is not enough. They need to be trained and updated on the specific issues to sexual assault victims. Resources are always limited due to the lack of funding, and centers continue to share what they have. For volunteers to continue the work, there has to be a 24-hour telephone service to allow access for victims during the crisis period, a definite place for victims to meet, and a place for volunteers and staff to maintain their resources. Volunteers need a trained professional person to seek advice and assistance from. These volunteers give generously of their time and energy to follow cases from the time of initial crisis through the medical procedures until the final disposition of a criminal proceeding. Citizens of New York State receive an enormous amount of service for the small amount of their tax-paying money. The Governor's Task Force on Rape and Sexual Assault included this statement in their final report regarding these volunteers. Quote, comprehensive statewide plans and policies regarding services for rape and sexual assault victims should acknowledge the enormous contribution of volunteers as a unique and valuable component to the delivery of victim services. However, you should know that it's becoming increasingly difficult to recruit committed volunteers due to the impact on their own personal economic, career, and family demands. Even when student interns are utilized, it is only for a short term and limited in the amount of time that they are required to give. With the shrinking volunteer corps and the little funds left for paid staff, who will provide services to the immediate years to come? We must also look at the impact on the loss of services to the community. It has taken rape crisis centers almost all of their 20 years to establish good working relationships with other community services. The development of these multidisciplinary teams has finally been accepted. To have them evaporate piece by piece curtails the overall healing process for the victim and leaves the community at a tremendous disadvantage. Rape crisis centers provide a response to a crisis situation any hour of the day or night, every day of the year. They provide immediate support and assist the victim as they begin to maneuver through the intricate medical and legal system. Many hours are spent explaining the procedures while providing that emotional support. Victims are vulnerable, and the system can be harsh. Continued support allows the victim to rebuild their lives. Centers have also assist the victim in the need of other community services through referrals. From one of the many focus meetings held in the Governor's Task Force on Sexual Assault, a voice still lingers. Quote, these are not women's issues or men's issues, these are human issues. The act of sexual assault does not discriminate. The next crisis call could be from your child, your mother, your sister or brother, maybe even you. Where will you turn when there is no one to pick up a phone? I can't tell you the feeling that I have when, after months of a sexual assault, to see the victim finally smile, to see the fear begin to fade and the wounds begin to heal. This victim will be a survivor. We can't really afford to have our budgets cut. All I can say is that on behalf of the rape crisis service providers, the survivors, and all the women and children in New York State, NYCASA urges the legislature to increase the Department of Health's budget line as it now stands for the rape crisis program by an additional $569,500 for the combination total of $1,050,000. This basically, we're asking it to be maintained at the present level. We're losing rape crisis centers, we're losing valuable staff people. A lot of the fiscal problem is causing staff turnover, changes. It's costing us more to retrain these people. It's having a large impact on the entire rape crisis system across New York State.
Let me just question something on your second page. You said New York City now only has one rape crisis program left that provides comprehensive services. What do you mean by comprehensive services? Are there other rape crisis centers in the city that provide lesser services?
Right. By comprehensive services, I mean they provide the crisis intervention, the legal advocacy, the medical advocacy, short-term and long-term counseling. The other programs that offer rape crisis work are usually hospital-based, and basically the only thing that they will do is provide the medical advocacy. Then they will refer people out to other resources in the community. But again, they may not be the appropriate resources. It's not, a lot of these resources are not trained specifically to meet the needs of a rape crisis victim.
And the hospital may be only medically oriented.
Right.
And where is that one center in the city?
Okay, that center is in Brooklyn. It's called Beware. It's the Brooklyn's Women Sexual Assault Exchange Program.
Okay, that was my question. Of course, we understand that you can't reduce a center from less than the one staff person that it now has. I mean,
majority of centers only have that one staff person, and many times they're part-time. If we reduce the budget, we can't cut them back to a quarter time, cut our rents back a quarter. I mean, these centers will have to close.
Helene?
I just wanted to know, besides the health department besides the health department funding, there's also some legislative initiated funding, individual member initiated funding that some of the centers receive, and some crime victims money. I assume you're equally concerned about some of those funds, because it's unclear what's the status of that money.
I was talking about the Department of Health funds. Crime victims, from what I understand, is being cut. Even the local funding that many of the centers are getting has already been cut. This is where the layoffs of if an agency is lucky enough to have funds to hire an educator, they're losing them. That money was probably awarded locally, and those funds are all being cut. So the centers are losing almost all of their budgets from one end or another at this point.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kelly. Next, we'd like to hear from Gwendolyn Wright, Director of the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
Good morning, distinguished guests. I'd like to voice my thanks on behalf of domestic violence programs in particular and women's programs across the state for having these hearings. We too share the concern of the legislature in regard to women's services and hope that we can all work together so that women's services are preserved in some way. At a time when domestic violence-related homicide is receiving unprecedented attention, New York State may be turning its back on abused women and children. Funding for shelters and other domestic violence programs is scheduled for a 60% cut in the governor's budget, a disproportionately deep cut even for a year of painful reductions across the board. These cuts threaten 15 years of progress by battered women's advocates and could very well cost lives. The progress in New York State has been steady and hopeful, considering that domestic violence has been culturally and legally sanctioned for hundreds of years. In 1976, the first shelter for battered women opened its doors in New York City. In 1977, change in the Family Court Act opened up a system to provide legal relief for battered women where none existed before. The statewide toll-free hotline answered its first call in 1981, and a hotline exclusively for Spanish-speaking victims began in 1985, the only one of its kind in the nation at that time, I might add. Throughout the state, law enforcement and other services are becoming more responsive to battered women. On the front lines of advocating for change are the shelters and advocacy programs for battered women. For more than a decade, these programs have struggled to survive financially. In 1987, Governor Cuomo signed into law the Domestic Violence Prevention Act, establishing for the first time in New York State a stable stream of funding for battered women's services. In 1989, the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence was established as a permanent state office, providing a strong voice within state government for battered women's services. This was clearly a message to women in the state that the legislature and the governor recognized battering as a societal problem that was not going away. Battering is the single major cause of injury to women, more frequent than automobile accidents, muggings, and rapes combined. Between 2,000 and 4,000 women are killed annually at the hands of their abusers. Approximately 41% of all women killed are killed by their husbands. Statistically, women are more likely to be victims of crimes in their own homes than on the street. The assailant is more likely to be an intimate than a stranger. Tragically, many women find the criminal legal system unresponsive, a shelter in their community unavailable, and no way out of a severely abusive relationship. Some strike back in self-defense. In spite of the widespread publicity of the battered women syndrome as a legal defense, most women driven to kill their abusers end up in prison. For these women, prison is often the first time that they feel safe from the heinous abuse. For others, it is simply the exchange of one prison for another. The cost of turning our backs on battered women is astronomical. For those women who strike back, it costs New York State $30,000 a year to keep them in prison. The cost of battering and lost work time and productivity, the toll on the legal system, and the drain on law enforcement are incalculable. Most costly of all are the cost of lives and the cost of the future. There is no dollar of value on the emotional trauma experienced by children whose daily lives are filled with fear. In spite of everything we know about domestic violence, in spite of the need for more shelters and more services, the governor's budget reduces domestic violence funding from $3 million in 1990 to $1.2 million in 1991. This will mean that several of the more than 70 programs developed since 1976 will close their doors in 1991. According to the New York State Department of Social Services, 12,433 women and children were denied shelter in 1990, 71% because of lack of space. This number will only grow as awareness continues to increase while resources shrivel. The governor's budget also suggests a shift from maintenance grants for residential services, a shift unsupported by and large by domestic violence advocates, to a per diem reimbursement system. Will New York remain in the dark ages when it comes to funding these services? We remain the only state in the nation that has set up a welfare system for battered women and their children. Eligibility requirements for shelter reimbursement are such that many women must make the tough choice between poverty and violence when seeking refuge. The average rate of reimbursement for shelters in this state is approximately $32 per person, and although the budget language allows for the Department of Social Services to have control over the setting of rates by localities, the cost of shelter far surpasses the amount that may seem reasonable. Additionally, many more non-residential services are provided than are reimbursable under the budget language. Domestic violence programs are held together by a patchwork quilt of funding. Many programs across the state fund advocacy programs with crime victims' monies. Children's programs receive funding from New York State Division for Youth Delinquency Prevention dollars, as well as legislative member items. The impact of cuts in these areas will mean less advocacy work and fewer services for children, the future of New York. I might add also that this year we also experienced with the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence a significant cut. And our concern in this regard has to do also with the voice that the office has provided within state government for domestic violence services. And our fear is that as we lose that voice, programs and services will also be lost. Domestic violence shelters save lives. This has been substantiated by battered women incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility who gave testimony at hearings held there in 1985. The New York State Domestic Violence Hotline continues to respond to calls from battered women around the state whose primary request is for shelter. Let's not step backwards. Let's not undo what a decade or more of hard work has provided. Let's continue to make New York safe for women and children. When domestic violence shelters start closing, the message we give to battered women is no one cares. a message they have heard far too often.
Thank you, Joan. We're aware that most of these services are operating on shoestring budgets, and there's really nothing much that can be cut out of them without decimating them. And many of us, Helene has been in the forefront. I know you were in the Bedford Hills hearing that. I was at that Bedford Hills hearing too, and Helene just recently came out with something you'll tell about. But we've been building up a network over a decade, and we are now seeing it decimated. So that is why we're here. And
let me also add that the recent budget freeze have had a serious impact on those programs. Many programs have already been forced to start cutting back services, laying off staff. On the other hand, in 1987, when the Domestic Violence Prevention and Services Act was established, it also, part of that was also the establishment of regulations for standards of services for domestic violence programs. So battered women's programs are feeling in a real catch-22. Where do we cut services, lay off staff, reduce our spending, and at the same time stay in compliance with state regs that we have? And a group of advocates from around the state have been meeting with members of the legislature and State Department of Social Services to try to work some of that out. Unfortunately, there isn't very much leeway. The standards of services were set up because of our sense that programs should be providing certain core services. To cut back on any of those services means that we are cutting back on what we consider the comprehensive needs of battered women and their families, so that we're already feeling the negative impacts of the budget. We don't and are not sure how we're going to survive through the rest of this year.
Helene?
I had a question. I first wanted to just introduce Earlene Hill, a member of the Assembly who has joined us. I was wondering, Gwen, if you could just expound upon the problems with the per diem. Obviously, the suggestion in the governor's proposed budget is that we can reduce state funding to domestic violence shelters because we're going to have this new source of funding via the per diem. And I know I've heard a lot, but I think we'd like to hear a little bit more about just why we can't do that.
Okay, I think that the primary problem with the per diems is that as it is set forth in the budget language, giving the Department of Social Services the authority to put out guidelines and to set those per diems on a county-by-county, program-by-program basis, that one of the concerns is that that process is not going to be in place until January of 1992. So that we will experience a 60% reduction in the funding that we had last year and have 8 or 9 month lag period between receiving monies from another source. We're also in a fiscal year where counties, I come from Ulster County, and I'm sure that you're all aware of the county screaming for mandate relief, so that battered women's advocates are gravely concerned that localities are going to be extremely resistant to the notion of picking up one more service. Additionally, the per diems vary from county to county and program to program. And it is our belief that the rural programs, the more rural programs in our state, are going to be hardest hit. Those programs are right now receiving per diem reimbursements of an average of about $22 per woman, and some of them receiving $10 per child. If the per diems that are set forth through the Department of Social Services are gravely increased, our concern is that the localities are going to be going to be extremely resistant to that increase in funding on their end. the experience has been thus far, and those advocates that have been meeting with their local departments, that there is just not the money on the local level to do this, and that the localities are feeling as if the state is pulling out, and that the state is not picking up their end of the deal and sort of dumping on the counties. Again, we were extremely encouraged in 1987 when the Domestic Violence and Prevention and Services Act was passed, and Assembly Member Weinstein worked diligently to help us get that passed. For us, it again established a long-term funding mechanism that we had sought for many years. And now we're seeing that funding mechanism being taken away from us. And again, this is on top of the cuts that programs are facing from Division for Youth, from Crime Victims Board, from their local, the whole controversy over the local member items that pick up a lot of those pieces. So that we are seeing, in a recent, let me just say that in a recent survey that was, informal survey that was done with programs, about 55% of all the programs in the state, when asked the question, how will this shift from maintenance grant funding to per diems affect their programs, about 55% acknowledged that it would cause cutbacks in the services that they're able to provide.
So that's twofold then. One of your concerns is that there'll be a lag where there'll be no money coming in for a number of months. Mm-hmm. And the second is that your per diem is going to be under what your maintenance was, and therefore you can't fund the same level of service. Thank you, Gwen. We've been joined by Assemblywoman Audrey Pheffer.
Thank you.
Yes. Bob Sponsz, President of the New York State Division of American Cancer Society. Welcome.
Thank you. Members of the Senate and Assembly Task Forces on Women's Issues and the New York State Legislative Women's Caucus, thank you for the opportunity to address the problem of breast cancer and the severe impact of the proposed budget cuts on breast cancer detection and education programs on efforts to combat this disease in New York State. I believe you all have a statement that I left with you. Basically, what I'd like to do is just be short and to the point regarding breast cancer and these particular programs. Breast cancer is a tragedy. It's a tragedy because the disease is so common. It's a tragedy because the disease is so curable, and yet so many women die of breast cancer in this country each year. The American Cancer Society has recently reported that 1 in 9 women will develop breast cancer in the United States this year. In New York State alone, 10,000 women will be diagnosed as having breast cancer, and more than 3,000 women will die of the disease here in New York State. Perhaps even more alarming is that over the last decade, the incidence of breast cancer has been increasing at a rate of 1% to 2% per year, and more alarming, in women under the age of 40, it has been increasing at a rate of 6% to 8% per year. So the problem that we face today is a problem today, but that problem seems to be ever increasing. Breast cancer, when caught early, is a disease that is highly curable. When a breast cancer is caught less than 1 centimeter in size, 95% of women can be cured of their disease. Unfortunately, we are not detecting breast cancer early enough today. It is because of this problem that the New York State breast cancer detection and education programs were funded beginning in 1988, and they received in years 88 and 89 $1 million each year. And really, because of the success of the programs, the allocation was increased to $2 million last year. These funds basically go to support 9 demonstration projects throughout the state, which really serve as an impetus for breast cancer education and detection services throughout the state. And again, I think it's been because of the success of the programs that the funding for those programs were increased last year. We've recognized other needs in terms of breast cancer screening, particularly as it applies to underserved populations of patients. And with the increased funding of last year, new programs were being funded that are particularly addressing those particular problems in rural and underserved populations of women. So all in all, this particular program is really New York State's only effort at addressing the problem of breast cancer education and detection, and these programs are just beginning and are just getting underway. Because of the magnitude of the breast cancer problem in this state, much more needs to be done. We're just beginning to scratch the surface. In addition to the demonstration projects that were being funded this past year, there was also the beginning of a secondary school education program, and that is just getting underway. Again, to stop the support and the funding for that particular program at this point in time would probably stop that dead in its tracks. There are various examples of breast cancer screening and detection programs that are sort of models throughout the state, which I think are a direct result of the support of this program. Certainly the Harlem Center that's dealing with Hispanic and Black populations is one example. Another example is at Glens Falls Hospital, where the mobile mammography unit is serving rural areas up in the remote Adirondacks. And there are many other examples of programs in this state that are being directly either supported or directly stimulated by this funding and this activity. Another factor to consider in relation to breast cancer detection and education program funding is the recent federal appropriation for state breast and cervical cancer programs under the Breast and Cervical Cancer Mortality Prevention Act of 1990. Basically, the New York State Department of Health is preparing an application for such funding, but that application is dependent upon New York State demonstrating a continued support in breast cancer detection activities and funding. So to curtail the funding for this particular program at this point in time would certainly be a major setback to New York State's application for such federal funding. We expect that the competition for that funding is going to be great, and therefore, however strong we can be in our position is certainly desired. Thought I would just leave you with two examples that personally affected me this week. 2 residents of New York State succumbed to breast cancer this week. One was a woman who was 45 years old. She had 2 children and lived in the rural Adirondack area. She had a positive family history for breast cancer. 2 years ago, however, due to a lack of education and a lack of access to screening services, when her breast cancer was detected, it was advanced, and over the last 2 years, she's been fighting that disease and succumbed to that disease this week. Another is a 70-year-old woman who, because of fear, apprehension, lack of knowledge concerning the disease, put off seeing a health professional for approximately 6 months. This also was about a year ago. Although she had access to screening services, it was her lack of education concerning the disease, the management of the disease, and the curability of the disease that prevented her from seeking medical attention. She also succumbed to the disease this week. These are just but 2 examples of the more than 3,000 women across the state who will die of the disease this year. I think the only greater tragedy to the disease itself would be for New York State to continue to fund such efforts in breast cancer education and detection And I would even put in a plug for greatly expanding that effort over the years to come, since this disease is certainly going to be perhaps the major health issue of women in the next decade. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. You said the figure is now 1 out of 9. I had thought it was 1 out of 10, which is awesome enough. It's now 1 out of 9?
Yes, the statistics back in the late 1960s were 1 in 14. In 1987, they were 1 in 10. In 1991, it's 1 in 9. And that's, again, because of the progressive increase in the incidence of the disease.
Some people say that the quality of the detection is so fine now. It's the mammograms have improved so much in the last 3-4 years that things that were never detected before are now being detected, and that sometimes it's questionable whether those would have ever moved along to become aggressive cancers. Would you like to answer that?
It's a complicated question relating to the biology of breast cancer. I think the point I would make is that breast cancer, when caught early, are in some of the earliest forms, and we're not quite sure whether these will ultimately become invasive breast cancers or whether they will always stay as non-invasive breast cancers. But the point is that all of the invasive breast cancers that we are detecting via a mammography screening program are usually caught when small, and therefore the curability of those particular cancers approaches 90 to 95%. So even though we may in fact be, perhaps in some instances, over-treating some of the non-invasive cancers, it is much better to do that, to be aggressively and adequately treating all of the invasive breast cancers.
I want you to think that I didn't support that. It was just what I'd heard. And indeed, in my area, I represent Westchester, we have wonderful services, and I know 50 women that are walking around perfectly healthy who have had, breast cancer. Any other questions?
I represent a portion of Nassau County, and I'm certain that you are aware that Nassau County does have a very large representation of breast cancer. But you did mention a program of which I would like very much if you would be kind enough to tell me a little bit about. The secondary education program. I would like to know where this type of program is, what grades, whether or not it's for girls and boys, and the scope of the program.
Basically, the State Health Department just solicited applications for people who were going to initiate such programs. This was just out of last year's funding. Basically, the 9 demonstration projects that were already in existence, plus 3 or 4 new projects, submitted applications for this particular program. I can't speak to what all of the applications contained, but I think basically all of them were going to address the issue of developing in secondary schools a fixed program that related to breast cancer education and being sure that this would be continued on an ongoing basis. It was hoped that actually by starting a nidus of interest in education in secondary schools, that the spin-off of that, of high school students taking that information home, would be a good way to disseminate, again, increased educational information relating to breast cancer. But
are there any programs already functioning?
Not
or are they just on the drawing board.
They've all been submitted, and I think the State Health Department is in the process of making the awards, and I think this month are supposed to announce who will be getting funding to initiate those programs.
Okay. Could I just ask one more question? I have received several letters from some constituents of mine, and I don't know whether this is really an area in which you might be able to address this, but I'll ask it anyway. If not, I'll seek answers elsewhere. One of my constituents had a mammogram, and she was very concerned about the amount of radioactivity that was input into her body, and she wanted to know whether or not that X-ray and the amount of X-rays that go with the mammogram would have any input towards additional tumors. Would you have any information to that? In addition, I've had other constituents who've questioned the degree of pain that goes with the medical exam as it relates to the mammogram, and I was wondering whether or not you would think that would have some impact on whether or not women would seek early medical attention if there is a modicum of fear that the pain would be too severe. Those two questions. I guess I asked two questions.
Sure. I guess I've been known to comment on anything that people ask me. First of all, relating to the risk of radiation related to mammography, let me state that the risk from radiation exposure in receiving a mammogram is minuscule. That the old machinery of 20 years ago delivered 10 to 20 times the dose of radiation therapy, or the dose of radiation for each mammogram that was given. That has been reduced by 10 to 20, by a factor of 10 to 20, and so mammography today is a perfectly safe procedure. Because of the way in which the technique of doing mammography is done, there is always a degree of discomfort associated with doing a mammogram. That to get a proper image on X-ray, the breast does have to be compressed, and depending on a woman's particular breast, depending on the presence of cystic disease within the breast, and many other factors, that may be more uncomfortable for some women versus others. I think at any of the breast cancer screening programs and screening centers around the state, I think every effort is made to minimize that discomfort for women, and also to educate them as to the reason why the discomfort, although for a short period of time, is important to get the best images possible. So again, I think that's I think both issues that you raise are part of the education process of educating women that mammography is safe and that to do a thorough and effective study requires some discomfort.
Thank you.
And the alternatives are much worse than the momentary pain of the... Yeah, Audrey.
We've been working, I'm from Queens County and Rockaways, and we've been working with the American Cancer Society there in Queens County on a task force approach to get out the information and the availability for the mammography. One of the questions that have come up, and we are seeking answers, but maybe, do you know of the problem with the Medicaid payments? Are you aware that there is a bit of problem in the interpretation in the Medicaid repayment for the mammography?
Yeah, I think that relates to the entire issue of low-cost mammography. That obviously, for mammography to be something that's available to all women, the cost has to be reasonable and has to be low. In addition, all insurance carriers need to reimburse for this preventive type of healthcare activity, which they have been somewhat reluctant to do in the past. More and more are now recognizing the fact that mammography is a very effective tool in the diagnosis of breast cancer, and therefore whatever expense is made in the prevention of the disease is well worth it and saves them in the long term in terms of savings of healthcare dollars. So with Medicaid, I'm not sure of what you're referring to specifically, except that usually the reimbursement for such a procedure is minimal, and often they have not wanted to reimburse for preventive types of activities, and yet many of them are coming around at this point in time.
Yeah, well, that's part of the problem that I think as a women's task force and group have to look into, because the legislation is a preventive measure. And in dealing with the issue in the Rockaways, where we have a high concentration of minority women who are being underserved, the Medicaid issue becomes a major problem, so that I think these hearings, and we'll further pursue, on that one item, but that's part of the problem, whether they interpret to pay when it legislatively was set up to be preventive, and if it's an interpretation of our legislation, we will deal with that. So that's the issue, really.
And I concur wholeheartedly. It makes no sense to me to be treating patients who have advanced disease when we could have been spending money to try and prevent the disease or to cure the disease at an early stage.
Thank you.
Yes.
We've been joined by a new member of the Assembly, Joan Christensen.
Okay, thank you, Bob. We're going to hear next from Rachel Leon of the Hunger Action Network of New York State. She is the DSS project coordinator. And after Rachel, we will hear from Christy Margelli from Family Planning Advocates. Welcome, Rachel.
Hello. The Hunger Action Network of New York State is a statewide membership organization of emergency food programs, advocates, and other individuals whose goal is to end hunger in New York State. Our 500 members statewide include food banks, food pantries, soup kitchens, welfare recipients, religious organizations, unions, cooperative extension offices, nutritionists, and advocates. Haney's appreciates the willingness of the Task Force on Women's Issues to examine the effect of the state budget on women, their families, and the communities across the state. As Haney's focuses primarily on the problem of hunger, we can certainly attest to the effect this year's budget will have on women and their families. Just as poverty is a women's issue, hunger is also a women's issue. Our members are forced to witness daily the human tragedies that have been created by the fiscal and social policies of our federal and state government. Our members are forced to see daily the pain of mothers who are losing the struggle to provide their children with enough to eat. Our members feel betrayed. What they started 10 years ago as temporary crisis programs are now entering their second decade of operation with no end in sight to the ever-rising demand for emergency food. Emergency food programs are not a solution to hunger. The bags of food distributed are pathetically inadequate to meet the nutritional needs of the families who are seeking help. The continued existence of these programs and the ever-increasing demand for services directly points to the flawed priorities of our state, federal, and local governments. Women and children are hungry in this country primarily because politicians have decided that it is politically acceptable for tens of millions of Americans to be hungry. 1 out of every 4 children in New York State is growing up in poverty. We are the only industrialized nation in the world besides South Africa that doesn't have a nationalized daycare system. We have a nation of ever-increasing single parents, mostly women, who are expected to work when they have no child care. How can we expect women to rise above the system when the system pushes them down? President Bush talks of a new world order when the United States cannot even control hunger on its own streets. Our federal government has for years now demonstrated their indifference to poverty and hunger. Now New York State stands with them, as demonstrated by the budget released this year. Haney's is certainly aware that New York is in a fiscal crisis, but it is precisely when a recession hits that you do not take away the services from those who are most vulnerable. Now is the time when those services need to be increased to meet the demands of more and more families struggling to make ends meet in a weak economy. Otherwise, today's starving children will be the future's fatalities. What does this year's budget say to women and children in our state? It says that the decade of the child is over, if it ever began. Specific cuts that will harm women tremendously are the proposed welfare cuts. In stark contrast to the stereotype of the typical welfare recipient as the able-bodied male is the reality that 90% of AFDC recipients are single mothers and their children. Welfare is a women's issue, and this year is a tragedy for these families. Haney's is opposed to all the cuts that have been proposed by the governor, cuts in Medicaid, restrictions on public assistance, and limitations on employment and training expenses for welfare reform all have the effect of hurting the most vulnerable in our society. How do we expect families to be self-sufficient if we don't even meet their most basic needs in order to help get them back on their feet? These cuts will only have the effect of putting more women and children in desperate positions where they will eventually end up costing the state more in emergency dollars. We support a public assistance increase. Currently, the maximum benefits available add up to about 87% of the poverty level. Public assistance benefits in New York have declined to less than 2/3 of their 1970 value after adjusting for inflation. For a family of 3, New York provides a benefit level of $577 per month, which is only 64% of the federal poverty level. Legislators who feel they need $60,000 a year for a part-time job shouldn't have any trouble comprehending that no one can survive in New York State with an income below the poverty level. We feel that SNAP should be increased, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This program supports 3 anti-hunger initiatives. Funds are provided to supplement the Federal Women, Infants, and Children program. Monies are used for Meals and Wheels programs for poor, frail elderly individuals, and food banks, food pantries, and soup kitchens receive funds for food, capital equipment, transportation, and operating expenses. Governor Cuomo has proposed a $500,000 cut from these emergency food programs. The SNAP Homeless and Destitute program is the major child feeding program in our state. They feed 300,000 children a month. It's probably the best bargain in the state budget. If the state had to operate these problems directly, the cost would run into hundreds of millions of dollars. It's about time that the state began to show some appreciation for these primarily volunteer programs. The demands for assistance from these programs have increased dramatically over the last year as the state's economy has gone into a recession. Many programs have been forced to close, at least temporarily, or reduce the amount of food provided to individual guests. It is estimated that every $1 that the state invests in SNAP results in $15 worth of food being provided to women and children in New York. The governor's strategy of solving a $6 billion deficit in the state budget by primarily cutting state spending during a recession will only make the recession work and increase the pain and suffering already being felt by the women and children in poverty in our state. One reason Haney's is here speaking today is to point to the problem areas within our government that can be fixed without large amounts of money. We are in a recession, and whatever measures can be taken to increase services without increasing funds to help women and their families survive should be aggressively pursued. We're concerned about issues related to the Department of Social Services performance, because more than 4/5 of the people using emergency food programs have already had some contact with Department of Social Services. If local DSS offices were doing their job in meeting the needs of eligible applicants and recipients, the demand for food from pantries and soup kitchens would be much less. Numerous reports that have been done by a wide variety of organizations in the last few years have all documented significant problems with the performance of local departments of social services. A Bar Association task force, which examined fair hearings and local DSS districts, concluded that local agencies are abusing the system and causing serious harm to the needy and to the system itself. It is clear that many low-income New Yorkers are not having their immediate needs met by local departments of social services. This results in women and their children ending up on the streets. It deprives them of food and medical care. As Michael Dowling, Deputy Secretary to the Governor, has repeatedly stated, for the last decade, we have concentrated on the issue of quality control with the counties, making sure people don't get the benefits they are not entitled to. Now is the time to restore the concept of social work to these agencies. We agree. In a year when many state officials feel that benefits to low-income New Yorkers cannot be expanded due to the state's fiscal crisis, Haney's believes it is essential that the legislature require corrective action by New York State Department of Social Services to ensure that individual counties are providing assistance to needy individuals, as already mandated by Congress and the state legislature. Some of our key recommendations include regular on-site monitoring by New York State Department of Social Services of local districts, including the use of testers to pose as applicants, much as is done with housing cases. The state should directly train all new County Department Social Service workers and should be responsible for ongoing training as well, particularly when new regulations and administrative directives are issued. Records of applicants should be started as soon as the initial contact is made to enable New York State Department of Social Services to monitor whether emergencies are being adequately dealt with. Maximum caseload sizes should be set, and the state must use its enforcement powers with local districts to ensure compliance with state and federal requirements. At a minimum, the state should be able to accomplish two basic objectives in each county. First, every person contacting DSS should be asked whether or not they have an emergency. And if the answer is yes, the person should be interviewed that day and their immediate need met. Second, individuals should be allowed to submit their application for assistance at any time to the DSS office, as is already required by law. Many offices limit the time during the day when they will accept applications, or they require the application to be submitted at the time of an interview. Since benefits are determined from the date the application is submitted, a delay in filing the application means that those benefits are lost forever. Food pantries are not to be used as a substitute for DSS action. We were designed to be a temporary emergency crisis program that would help the few individuals who fell through the cracks. All too often, the pantries have turned into an extension of the DSS office. We feel that DSS should be required to provide security deposits for PA recipients seeking housing. This specifically hurts women because the direct result of not granting security deposits is homelessness. And no one is hurt more by this than women and their families. The lack of security deposits provided to recipients has forced them to continue to live in shelters and welfare motels, or has pushed them into unsafe and inadequate housing. Changing the law to mandate the provision of security deposits would significantly increase the access of PA recipients to adequate housing. This would require small amounts of money invested and would result in long-term financial savings. I hope the legislature will make it clear to New York State Department of Social Services that it needs to improve the administration of the programs it has been given to administer, because these are important programs which the future of our children depend upon. The quality of life in New York State has declined significantly over the last decade. Millions of New Yorkers, particularly women and children, are at risk of hunger. More than 100,000 residents are homeless. Our infant mortality rate rivals that of third world countries. The high school dropout rate is 34%, and 15% of state residents don't have health insurance. These problems will only worsen if the state tries to solve its budget woes by cutting spending and laying off state workers. Rather than relying on budget cuts as the primary means to solve the budget deficit, the legislator must recognize that the wealthy and large corporations must pay a fair share of the tax burden. The structural part of the deficit is primarily due to the enormous tax cuts provided to higher income taxpayers since 1987. During the same time period, their share of total income has increased dramatically. Over the last decade, the share of total state income of the top 1% of the state's taxpayers went up 137%, while their share of taxes paid out of income declined by 33%. The Albany Times-Union recently editorialized in favor of restoring progressivity to the state's income tax. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to ask any questions? We'll try. On the order of witnesses, accidentally, Christy Margelli was left off. She's on my original list. She's the Assistant Executive Director of Family Planning Advocates of New York. I'm sorry, Christy. Well, it's the original list. It just accidentally slipped off. We're human.
Good morning. I am Christy Margelli, the Assistant Executive Director for Family Planning Advocates of New York State. I speak to you today on behalf of the 250 publicly funded family planning clinics, which serve 300,000 women of childbearing age who must rely each year on their services in every county of the state. These clinics form the largest single network of primary care services for both urban and rural women, who are the fastest growing population without private insurance to cover their health care. For most of these medically indigent women, the family planning clinic is their first entry point into the healthcare system and often their only source of care, especially in those 17 upstate counties where there are no other providers of subsidized primary care. Of the 300,000 patients we serve annually, nearly 80% have incomes below 150% of poverty, and only 15 to 20% meet current Medicaid eligibility requirements. Less than 0.5% are covered by private insurance. So family planning clinics must rely on public funds, both grants and Medicaid, to provide subsidized services to a vulnerable population, women who are a veritable who's who of those at highest risk for cervical cancer, sexually transmissible diseases or STDs, and HIV, as well as unintended adolescent pregnancy, all of which have serious, irreversible, and sometimes lifelong consequences. The services routinely offered to patients, in addition to contraception, include screening for thyroid and heart disease, hypertension, anemia, sexually transmissible diseases, HIV infection, clinical exam for cancer of the breast and cervix. While the governor proposed no significant cut in family planning in his executive budget this year, there is still a $10 million gap between actual grant dollars and the real funding needed just to maintain our minimum level of services. And that's part of what I'm here to bring to your attention today. In addition, new mandates for syphilis testing and measles without new funds, sharp increases in Pap test costs, and a growing demand for both STD and cancer screening services have stretched family planning clinic funds to the limit. The burgeoning demand for care and inability to compete with salaries offered by hospitals, which got a nursing salary adjustment last year, HMOs, and other providers has meant a literal revolving door in family planning clinics, staff turnovers as high as 50% in some areas, and long waits for clinic appointments. Essentially, this means that patients with nowhere else to go are being turned away. The upshot is they do re-enter the healthcare system later, but by that time it's for more serious problems which require costly secondary and tertiary care. In fact, we have reason to believe that women on Medicaid are 3 times more likely to be hospitalized for reproductive health problems than women who are not on Medicaid. For far too many years, this has been the pattern for far too many low-income uninsured women. Women's health has been a low-budget priority, and women's health care has not been equitably funded. Thus, women are denied early basic primary care that could have prevented or ameliorated reproductive pathologies, which left untreated eventually cost them their productivity, their reproductive health, and even their lives. One example you've heard mentioned today already is breast cancer. New York State has the highest incidence of breast cancer of any state in the nation, and the 4th highest rate of breast cancer deaths. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, CDC, 30 to 40% of those deaths are preventable with early detection and treatment. Yet in our state, while nearly twice as many women die of breast cancer as men and women combined die of AIDS, the executive budget includes no separate funding for prevention of breast disease. Not the $2 million added last year by the legislature to promote breast cancer screening and education, although it's limited to some selected areas of the state. While there is coverage for mammography for older women who have insurance, there are no funds earmarked for breast exams done by clinicians in ambulatory settings like family planning clinics, where the vast majority of low-income, uninsured women are served. Cervical cancer deaths, which according to CDC are entirely preventable, are also on the rise. There have been no funds appropriated to offset the cost of Pap tests, which tripled since 1988 when legislation was passed to limit the number of slides a cytotechnologist could read in a 24-hour period. This has further stretched the funding of family planning clinics, which are the largest provider of Pap tests to low-income and uninsured women, who are in turn at highest risk for cancer of the cervix. And it has resulted in fewer patients served because it's impossible to provide expanded and more costly care and maintain the same patient caseload if funding remains static. Since the 1988 law, both the number of Pap tests and the number with abnormal results have increased. In just 1 year, 1989 to 90, abnormal Pap tests increased 16% in family planning clinics, and the need for colposcopy exams, a crucial diagnostic follow-up to abnormal Paps, also rose sharply. But again, there are no funds to subsidize these critically needed preventive services for medically indigent women. With decreased access to even the most basic screening and treatment, fewer cases of cervical cancer will be detected early, and rates of invasive cancer and cancer deaths will tragically continue to rise. The third example is sexually transmissible diseases, which are absolutely out of control in our patient population. Women under age 25 account for 2/3 of all STD cases. The number of syphilis cases in teenage girls in New York shot up 280% in just the last 5 years, while syphilis among New York women in general has increased over 500% in roughly the last decade, while during that time cases in white males declined by 2%. But the resurgence of syphilis is mild compared to epidemic rates of other equally serious sexually transmissible diseases in women, such as human papillomavirus, trichomonas, and chlamydia, which is the most prevalent infection. Since 1984, family planning clinics have experienced a 327% increase in treatment of sexually transmissible diseases and vaginitis. Testing, diagnosis, and treatment of chlamydia alone tripled in just 1 year. This exponential increase in STDs among women is especially alarming, since these infections are often asymptomatic in women and frequently go undetected until complications have set in. Complications such as pelvic inflammatory disease, which can cause ectopic pregnancy, a leading cause of maternal death, infertility, and even sterility. STDs can significantly increase a woman's risk of cervical cancer. Herpes alone increases the risk 3 to 4-fold. STDs can even increase a woman's risk of HIV infection by as much as 7-fold. And many STDs have serious adverse consequences for infants born to infected women. Despite this startling increase in STDs in women and its far-reaching consequences for themselves and their family, there is not one dime in state funds targeted to women for prevention, early screening, and treatment of STDs. The only funding comes through Article 6 state aid for county health department STD programs, which serve males predominantly. Only 35% of patients at these clinics are women, while we serve nearly 100% women, and they are the few with recognizable symptoms, which means the damage to their health may already have been done. Family planning clinics actually provide about 40% of all STD screening done in the entire state. But to do so, we must rob funds from prevention of unintended pregnancy among poor women and teenagers. Clearly, in light of all that I've told you, our baseline is to urge that no further cuts be made to an already overburdened family planning program. We need the women of the legislature to ensure that this program, which is the only significant funding for women's health, is able to maintain its minimum services, and if at all possible, to direct additional funds to family planning for breast and cervical cancer screening and STD services, which are draining critically needed funds earmarked for prevention of high-risk unintended pregnancies. Any loss of funds would further exacerbate the existing inequity in women's health care and fuel the budget crisis by significantly increasing state costs for hospitalizations, chemotherapy, major surgery, and other care. It would also add to the over $2 billion each year that the state spends on Medicaid, food stamps, and AFDC alone for families started by a teenager. Since the state pays only 5% of family planning costs under Medicaid, family planning is the only service with a 90% federal share. The proposed Medicaid rate freeze for diagnostic and treatment centers, which does include family planning clinics, would not save the state money. It would in fact cost more in the long run because fewer teen births would be averted, fewer women would be screened early for breast and cervical cancer, and fewer STDs would be detected. Approximately $375,000 in federal money would be turned back, but this would cost the state approximately $800,000 in the first year for AFDC alone, almost $2 million when other state social services are added, not including even housing and child protective services. If those women who could have been provided preventive services with that federal funding are turned away, New York needs to do more to support the family planning clinic's efforts to reach uninsured women and protect their health, not create more barriers which impede access to care. And as many of you know, there's no question of the value of investing in pregnancy prevention services that the family planning clinics provide. Births to adolescents contribute to some of New York's most serious problems: low birth weight, infant mortality, child abuse, school dropout, homelessness, border babies, unemployment, and poverty. Although only 10% of all births in New York State are to teens, births to teenagers account for 60% of the AFDC caseload, and the cost to the state for teen births, as I mentioned, is well over $2 billion annually. But these teen pregnancies can be reduced by expanding contraceptive services. Providing family planning services for women of all ages generates enormous savings for the state. A 1990 Alan Guttmacher Institute study, which reinforced the findings of many previous cost-benefit analyses, found that $11.30 is saved for every dollar spent in publicly funded contraceptive programs. The state of California found savings of $89 in the first year alone for every dollar spent on family planning for a woman on public assistance. Regarding sexually transmissible diseases, in terms of cost benefits, I think one example speaks volumes. According to Health Department estimates, the annual cost to New York State of chlamydia-related pelvic inflammatory disease alone is over $100 million. Early detection and treatment of STDs, made possible through state funds to family planning clinics targeting low-income women and adolescents, could avert both devastating health consequences and save the state money. In closing, let me say that I'm genuinely grateful for this opportunity to share these thoughts with you, because you have been such long-standing supporters of the family planning clinics and of the critical services they provide to women. At this time of crisis, we need your support more than ever, and it's vital that we continue to work together to explore every avenue for funding such essential and cost-effective services, to find the right combination of resources without terrible trade-offs that cause vulnerable, high-risk adolescents and women to suffer. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. The costs of not providing these services are so astronomical, and you have outlined that. We've been joined by State Senator Velmanette Montgomery. Any questions, Joan? No? Okay, we're going to move right along because we have session very shortly, and we want to hear from each of you. Carol Wallace, the Legislative Director of the Coalition of the Concerned for Older American.
Yes, the Coalition of the Concerned for Older Americans is a program of resources for midlife and older women, which is the nation's first licensed mental health clinic, especially for the needs of women. It's also a not-for-profit social services center that provide a wide range of services. It's like a one-stop center. It's very unique. I'm particularly pleased to be able to talk about the impact of the state budget because it's so totally comprehensive and a complete calamity for the elderly population. I think this forum, this budget forum is an excellent idea, and I was hoping as I listened to the many wonderful, not wonderful, but I mean impressive statistics, that you could do a quick and dirty fact sheet with bullets and get it out very quickly to advocates as they make the rounds. My experience in working in workshops, giving out the statistics on older women, it really energizes people because they don't realize, and although we've heard these statistics sort of in different places, it's every time, even myself, every time I review these statistics, I'm just amazed. Just a quick overview, the 19% of aging programs have been cut, and the small agency, of course, the State Office for Aging, has been cut by 25%. And when you look at the statistics on older women, which I have to take a minute to do here, you will realize why this overview is so important, because every single aging program is essentially a woman's program. The first statistic that you think about and look at and are amazed at is the fact that the majority of women are genetically programmed to live a decade longer than the average man. So they're the survivors. Currently in New York State, 60% of the population over 65 are women, and as that population ages, by the time you reach the age of 85, it's 70% are women. So that in itself, just the demographic picture there, shows you why aging programs are so important for women. Another statistic that always amazes me, 85% of wives outlive their husband, 25% of mothers outlive their eldest son. And by the year, because of the medical improvements, by the year 2025, 1 out of every 5 New Yorker will be over the age of 65, and of course most of those will be women. But before we, feel good about the gender superiority of women, we also have to look at review the downside, the statistics on the quality of life for these women that live a long time is not good at all, because of a long history in our society of discrimination against women when they're in their working years, when their marriages dissolve for a number of different reasons. Many women face poverty for the first time in their lives. Even comfortably middle-aged women or older women who think they've been happily married, and they become a widow, and they're suddenly find out much too late that they're plunged into poverty. And of course, government policies discriminate against women. We know what happens in Social Security. This is part of the reason that women are in poverty in their older years, because Social Security discriminates against women. The Commonwealth Fund Commission in 1987 did an interesting study that proved that if you look at the elderly population totally, there had been a slight improvement in the standard of living. But if you look at older women specifically, the picture is not good. Nationally, females account for 63% of the elder population, but they represent 73% of the elderly poor and 82% of poor elders living alone. And their projections are not good. In the next century, they think that the elderly poor living alone will be even worse off. But here in New York State, we don't have to wait for the next century to see that happen. This budget will do it very quickly. I think all of the human services advocates have good evidence that if certain programs are cut, it's going to cost the state more in the long run. But for the elderly, the long run isn't very long. I mean, you're talking weeks, months before many elderly will be institutionalized because there are no programs to help them stay in the community or to help them stay well enough to stay out of institutions. The position of resources and COCO is the same as many of these advocates, that we must do something to restore the equity principle in the tax schedules, to bring in more revenue. This is a legitimate source. the very wealthy are not carrying their fair share of the deficit, the burden of the deficit, and we need to bring in more resources to at least lighten the load of some of these program cuts. I was intrigued with one of your questions about a woman's budget. I think that's an excellent idea, and I think it should be structured, of course, with equity in mind based on numbers and the degree of need, as the statistics on older women clearly demonstrate. I know some people have turned to the idea of consolidation of agencies as a way of saving money. We were extremely relieved that the governor agreed with us that the State Office for Aging must maintain its autonomy. And although outside groups have suggested that it should be folded in as a bureau, but I think that that's a very bad idea, not cost effective, and very damaging to the special needs of the older population. State Office for Aging at least has I think, a very good idea that I assume you've heard of by now, the Managed Access to Aging Services, MASS idea, that would combine long-term care services and get rid of some of the duplication of services, and could be a cost-effective program in the long run. It has a long way to go, but I bring that to your attention because it has the support of certainly of the elderly population. Well, looking at the range of aging programs, I'm embarrassed that my testimony is long, and I'll try to cut it down as much as I can.
To cut it down because we are disappearing at 12.
That's right, I know, and you certainly can read it. The programs that I've picked out are ISEP, Caregiver Resource Centers, the SNAP, which has already been addressed, and we know how important that one is to the elderly, SSI Outreach, and EPIC, and Medicaid. I mean, all of these are very important to the elderly, and I'll just try to pick out a couple of points in each one. You certainly know what the programs are. One of the things I want to say about ISEP, as you know, that $6.7 million that was put in the budget is an annualization figure. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that this is an increase. And they're so hungry for dollars that they're looking for places to chip away. And I can't say strongly enough, we must not let that happen with ISEP. It's very important to women. It's not an increase, and it's woefully underfunded anyway. I mean, there's huge waiting lists. So that's one thing I want to say about that program. In relation to that also, I think we have to be very careful about not letting the personal care level 1 be eliminated from the Medicaid, because that impacts ISEP very directly, and it also impacts caregivers, who are primarily women, which brings me to my next topic, the Caregiver Research Centers, which is a very small program. It was increased by $250,000, and again, people are hungrily looking at that paltry amount of money, but I think it has to stay there for a couple of reasons. It saves the state billions of dollars, the caregivers, the services they provide, and it also will help the women, who are 72% of caregivers are women. The other interesting statistic is that 80% of all long-term care is provided by informal caregivers. So that amount of money should also be protected, because the job of a caregiver is very, very difficult. It's an emotional, physical, financial drain on women, and they need all the help they can get, and these centers will at least help them with resources. I mentioned SNAP. The important thing to say about SNAP, in addition to the fact that, of course, it does provide nutrition for isolated elderly who are primarily women, it also allows people to get into the homes of some of these isolated elderly and identify people who need other programs like SSI, HEAP. And these people don't know these programs exist or that they're eligible for them. So that is a very important side effect of the SNAP program. The SSI outreach money was originally, at one point, up to $1 million, and it gradually was cut back, and now we're down to $350,000. only, and even that's being looked at, I know on the Senate side in particular, on the basis that the program may not be cost effective because they're not enrolling enough people, but we know how difficult it is to reach isolated elderly. They're very afraid of government, and so it's a long, slow process. And I don't think numbers of people enrolled is what's important here. What is important is that the majority of these people are women. They're in deep poverty, they need help, and there's an estimated 50% of that population in New York State, counting both men and women, that are eligible for this program and are not being reached. I think also, another thing I want to say about Supplemental Security Income program, which is SSI, I should have said that, is that middle-income women should be very careful to watch out for this program because you are going to live into your 80s, you're going to spend down your resources, and you are going to be on SSI. You will be surprised. The women I've interviewed who had been teachers, you name it, on SSI because they lived so long. EPIC is another program I want to mention. That, of course, the pharmaceutical drug program. There again, women use more drugs than any other legal medications than any other group in society. They also are given an awful lot of psychotherapeutic drugs because the medical profession thinks that it's a normal condition for women to be depressed, give them a pill and send them home. So they take a lot of pills, 3 times more than men, and this program is very important to women. We just got the bad news that in spite of the fact that the governor put in $45 million for EPIC, we're now another $8 million short. The EPIC panel will meet next week, and apparently the only thing they can do is raise the co-payments under the existing program, and on top of that, of course, we've lost the wonderful reform program that we thought we got in the last session, because that would have cost another $20 million. So that program is just in deep trouble, but it's, again, if you think of women, that's it. Medicaid, cost containment, the optional services are all particularly hard. If you take away dentistry, podiatry, audiology, private nursing, I mentioned personal care, home services level 1. All of these things are very important to the elderly. And then, of course, co-payments and utilized thresholds. The elderly are more apt to be ill longer, and those things really impact them disproportionately. And again, most of them are women. They are the poor. The other thing I want to mention very quickly is that I assume you've gotten a memo from Brookdale Center on Aging on the repeal section of the social services law, which would impact spouses in particular when they try to access home care Medicaid. And you think of the spousal impoverishment situation where they have to spend down in order to get that. So that's a very insidious move to save a few dollars, and I urge you to take a good look at that. Well, I think I'll have to stop there. I mean, there's so many other things to say that affect women, and I feel guilty not saying them, but we've run out of time. I do want to say just a couple of quick words about resources in connection with member items. You will notice that I attached this list from Assemblyman Herrenberg on all of the aging cuts, but what's missing from here is not only that repeal of the social services law that I mentioned on Medicaid, but the $9 million in member items that go to aging programs, and many of these programs provide all sorts of services that the state programs do not provide. And one of them are the services of resources for midlife and older women. It started in 1984 with the help of a member item from Paul Herrenberg and others, and then Speaker Fink. It's been maintained for 6 years, and it's grown. It's been able to add on becoming a licensed mental health clinic in addition to the other services it provided. And then to have it suddenly cut 50% without any warning, it's like it's been an investment for taxpayers, and it's been by taxpayers, a good and sound investment, and just suddenly pull that away it just makes no sense. And it's, I think Resources itself 2 years ago offered a $10,000 cut in its own item as it's grown stronger, and had hoped to move more in that direction. But it's not quite ready yet. But I think we have to try to keep these very unique special programs alive. So with that, oh, no, I'm sorry, I have to do one more. One of the things I bring to your attention is that a service that Resources could provide for the homeless, many of whom are elderly now and women, is to change a regulation in the mental health laws, which will take effect April 1st, which does not allow a clinic like Resources to go to a homeless center or a senior center and provide mental health services. Now, as you know, many of the homeless are mentally ill. That's why one of the reasons they're homeless. Under this regulation, the homeless have to go to the clinic. Now, what's your guess as to how often that's going to happen? By changing that regulation so that they can then go to the homeless center or a senior center in order to be reimbursed. What we're talking about, of course, is being reimbursed under Medicaid. To allow that to happen, they can provide services for women who need it desperately to get their lives back together, hopefully maybe return to, quote, normal society, mainly poverty for most women, but nevertheless, at least not being in a homeless shelter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. Are there any questions? Then we're trying to limit the questions. Thanks, Carol. We have your testimony, and we are going to read it. It has a lot of facets to it. Okay, our next speaker is Pat McLean, director of the Albany Displaced Homemakers Center. And, you know, we're all very concerned to follow up what Carol said with our member items. A lot of us have used our member items for the displaced homemakers, for these kind of services, and we are not sure what's going to happen, and we think nothing good is going to happen in the area of member services and those of member items, and those of us who have been using it for really areas of desperate need are really concerned. There ain't no pork barrel where I'm using it. I'm using it for food pantries, stuff like that. Welcome.
Good morning. I represent the New York State Displaced Homemakers Center Directors Association as well as the Albany Displaced Homemakers Center. I'm the director of the center, which is administered by the New York State Labor Community Services Agency. The New York State Department of Labor Displaced Homemaker Program faces a 10 to 15% overall cut in the 1991 executive budget. This is a devastation to our center. We have 3 employees and see over 300 clients a year, most of them several times. Where there can be no question of reducing staff or staff hours, there is a real possibility of substantial reduction of salaries. The 2 other women on the staff have total financial responsibility for raising their children. This year, in a very bare-bones budget, we had 0 money for stipends for clients, client daycare, travel for clients, advertising, or office cleaning. We do have an agreement with Human Resources, which is JTPA in Albany, to pay stipends to eligible women. However, there are women who are not eligible by their guidelines who need stipends in order to attend the reentry program. When the $3,400 that was promised in last year's budget was rescinded, we were forced to cancel the college credit public speaking course that was offered to each group member. Our budget paid individual tuitions, and Hudson Valley Community College paid the professor's salary. We do not have enough money left in this year's budget to buy the supplies we need to finish the program year. We don't even have enough money left in the budget for long-distance phone calls. And the staff is personally buying items for the center that are not covered in the current grant. To take 10 to 15% out of this budget will obviously cut sharply into salaries, curtailing services, and probably moving the center. In larger centers, staff will be reduced to part-time, and some centers may have to close. Obviously, all of this means a reduction of services at a time when unemployment is increasing and each job has many candidates. As job seekers, displaced homemakers need to have a clear picture of their marketable skills and know how to effectively run a job search. The services that we provide are not duplicated by any other program, and we have all worked very hard, and I believe successfully, to create working linkages with other agencies to offer the most comprehensive program possible. I've previously mentioned the stipends. The Albany Adult Learning Center provides space and computers for the computer literacy class, which is now a standard part of our program. We also have a group of volunteers who cheerfully volunteer their expertise in offering workshops in the reentry program. It is no accident that the New York State Displaced Homemakers Centers are funded by the Department of Labor. We have always thought of ourselves as an economic development program. The statewide figures as compiled in the 89-90 budget by the Department of Labor indicated the following. Over 2,000 displaced homemakers served returned to work. 2,500 displaced homemakers were placed in education or training. They contributed over $16 million to the state's economy through wages, provided an economic estimated income on the state of over $48 million. The Department of Labor currently estimates that 15% of displaced homemakers are social services recipients, and of those placed in jobs and then go off social services, provide an estimated savings to the state of between $1 million and $1.7 million. One does not have to be a rocket scientist to know that significant financial loss in one program year affects the program forever, and that loss translates to a higher percentage of women and children living below the poverty level. Since I'm only familiar with the portion of the budget that affects the displaced homemaker centers, I can't comment on a women's budget. I would, however, urge the legislature to restore the funding to the centers. It does seem apparent that it is imperative that every effort should be made to assist women in becoming economically self-sufficient and raise their children in financially and emotionally secure households. I believe that these women would become a constituency that would demand fiscal responsibility on the part of both the federal and state governments.
Thank you. Are there any questions of Pat?
In terms of the funding cuts, I understand that there's an issue not only for the centers generally, I don't know specifically for your center, not only of a proposed cut in the budget, but there's an issue of money for this the current fiscal year, not being reappropriated.
Right, yes. I understand that is going to happen, and I don't think it's been addressed, or I haven't heard that it has been.
So there's really two issues. There's not only the issue of the cutting in the 91-92, but also trying to see what we can to get the reappropriated money, to get the money that is due the centers or would be due the centers reappropriated.
Yeah, the centers all have different, we don't all have the same fiscal year. So it affects some centers more than others. Ours happens to be a later year, so we're more affected by it than a center who ends their program year April 1st.
Helped start the one in Westchester County, and we are
you're a late
facing
starter.
the possible discontinuation. It's so painful for those of us who start wonderful programs, and God knows if we're going to survive this year.
Well,
we're going to try.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no questions, then we'll go on to Sandra Laam, Executive Director of the New York State Child Care Coordinating Council. And our last speaker will follow Sandra, and that's Anita Elliott, Vice President for Campus Affairs of the Student Association of the State University. Hi, welcome, Sandra.
Thanks. Senator Oppenheimer, Senator Montgomery, and Assemblywoman Weinstein, I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. I was not able to, we didn't have enough advance notice to prepare written testimony, but you have a packet of materials in front of you, and I would like to draw your attention to some of those, particularly the proposed disbursement of new federal child care funds. As you know, there is significant increase in the amount of funding coming into New York State from the federal government for child care this year. In the governor's proposed budget, there is no allocation of those funds. They occur as a lump sum with directions to the Division of Budget to assign the funding where it's needed. We trust the legislature more than we trust the governor's office to do a good job of assigning those funds, and so we would ask you to pay attention to how those funds are to be allocated. Many of these programs you're familiar with. I'd like to just mention a few of them that are particularly problematic this year. Under the Low-Income Daycare Fund, we are able to target significant increases in that area to subsidize child care for our lowest income families in New York State. However, one of the ways that this funding has not been as effective as it should be is that when the reimbursement goes to providers for that subsidized care, it's going at less than what it costs to deliver the services. When welfare reform laws were put into effect, there was a requirement that reimbursement to child care providers be at the actual cost of care up to a calculated market rate within each community. We have just completed a draft survey, which is also in your packets, to find out what counties are actually spending, what is their reimbursement rate to providers. Less than half of the counties in New York State are actually paying up to market rate for welfare reform. They are also allowed to pay up to market rate for all other child care subsidies. Only 13 counties are paying market rate for other child care subsidies. Among those 13 counties are Nassau and Tompkins. The other 11 are small upstate counties that spend almost no money on child care in the first place, so it's easy for them to say they're going to pay market rate because they buy almost no child care. We would like to see in the budget language that requires counties to reimburse at market rate or actual cost of care for every child care program. Providers are saying we can no longer afford to lose $20 to $40 a week providing this child care service, and we don't want to administer several different programs. Pay us the same rate and pay us what it actually costs. So that's issue number one. I'd like to also point out that reimbursement rate was also promised to providers. The increase in reimbursement rate was promised when the salary enhancement program was phased out. And now we are seeing that salary enhancement program decimated. The money that was in last year's budget has never gone out to counties or to providers, and so they need the reimbursement rate as at least maintaining the actual cost. The second item I'd like to draw your attention to is the Child Care Resource and Referral Program. As you know, that was begun 3 or 4 years ago. There's a system of about 22 state-funded child care resource and referral agencies now in New York State. They've been shown to be very effective in helping parents access quality child care and also in developing and maintaining a supply of quality child care services that are targeted where they're most needed within communities. There's two problems with the child care resource and referral system as it now stands. One is that it only covers about half the state, and the other is that in the original funding formula was a spend down. Organizations were given 100% of their allocation in the first year. By year 3, that was reduced to 50%. So as the need for child care services became more important, as their role in expanding services for welfare reform participants and helping them access services was added to their responsibilities, the funding was cut in half, and there's no other way to make this up. We'd like to see federal funds targeted to the Resource and Referral Program to bring the total state allocation up to $5 million, which would take care of both of those problems. The third point I'd like to draw your attention to is training. As you know, we have very high turnover rates and low wages in the child care field. To develop and maintain quality staff in both centers and family daycare homes, we need adequate funding for training. There is currently virtually no training for daycare center staff in New York State. We need to make sure that whatever funding is put into the budget has language which targets both centers and family daycare providers, and that there's adequate funding so that the requirements of the family daycare registration program for 15 hours of training per renewal, it can be met. Fourth, there's a need for the targeting of low-income students in SUNY and CUNY programs who need child care subsidies. Without getting into the real technical aspects of this, it's impossible to get child care subsidies through the Department of Social Services to students in 4-year programs. Low-income women who are looking to advance their career and become and stay self-sufficient often are pursuing four-year degree programs. We would like to see part of the funding coming from the federal government flow through higher education so that it can go to SUNY and CUNY campuses and provide direct subsidies to low-income families, whether they are pursuing two-year or four-year degree programs. A fifth point has to do with implementation of the registration program and licensing of child care programs in New York State. As you are aware, the legislature several years in a row allocated and then reappropriated funding to expand the number of daycare licensing offices in New York State and improve the staffing levels. What's happened, in fact, is that the two new offices have never been opened, and that where in 3 upstate offices provisional employees were hired, those employees were not retained, and their positions were left unfilled because they got caught in the hiring freeze. We have a number of counties upstate now that have no daycare centers with valid licenses. We have group family daycare providers who have been waiting 18 months for renewal. In Westchester County, 65% of daycare centers have expired licenses. This not only has an impact on families' access to regulated care, it means that they cannot draw down USDA funds if they don't have a valid license, which is millions of dollars that comes into New York State free each year with no local match of any kind required, and they're in jeopardy of losing their liability insurance. God forbid anything should happen to a child in any of these programs where their licenses have expired and the state has abrogated its responsibility to regulate. We need to see if there is additional funding given to the State Department of Social Services to license and to implement the registration program, that the freeze be lifted so that those positions can actually be staffed with real people. We can't have that money going into the system, paying off the deficit, and not have it translated into real people who will do real licensing of real child care programs. One additional point, it relates to the Title 20 cuts that are in the governor's budget. Without getting, again, this is very complicated and the implication of this varies from county to county. We are very concerned with increasing mandates while it's at the same time cutting cutting state contribution to those the requirements that are placed on the counties. What will happen? We're concerned on 2 levels. One is that counties will choose not to maintain their efforts in daycare because they just are not able to come up with the local dollars to do that. And secondly, that our ability to draw down the federal child care money that we're expecting and building our whole child care system around will be placed in jeopardy, because if statewide we are not maintaining our effort, the federal government will not allow us to draw down the money we're entitled to. So the Title 20 cuts are very serious and must be restored, not only for daycare but for other service areas as well. Thank you for your attention. There's much more detail in the materials you've got. I'd be happy to answer any questions now, or you could feel free to call our office.
Thank you, Sandra. Are there any questions now? You will, of course, be hearing from us. Okay, and our last speaker is Alice van der Hoef-Raab. Sorry, poor script here. She's an intern with SASU, Women Caucus.
Hello. I have passed out copies of SASU's response to the governor's budget. Please use this as a general reference, but I'm here to speak specifically on how this budget will affect the women in SUNY. Unlike other state agencies, SUNY has flexibility over where it makes its cuts and spends its money. This testimony is based on past experience and SUNY projections. With the governor's proposed budget, including a $500 tuition increase, there will be 1,500 positions lost. Half of these position losses will be in faculty. A large percentage of women teaching on the SUNY campuses are adjunct professors. These are the first positions to go in times of budget problems. And there are already too few women teaching on the campuses. Along with that, programs will have to be cut if the budget stays as it is. What programs are cut is left up to the individual campuses. But if past cuts are anything to go by, many women's studies programs will be cut. And it's sad to say in this day and age that we need women's studies in order to learn our history, but it's true. If the campuses cut women's studies programs, they will deny half of their students the opportunity to learn their history. Student Services gets $8 million state subsidy that SUNY is removing and replacing with a $100 mandatory health fee that is not covered by financial aid. Healthcare services already do not address the needs of women students, and with cuts to their funding, these needs will still not be addressed. A student was sitting in on a SUNY Central Committee meeting on the health fee, where they discussed what was essential health care. When the subject of gynecology was brought up, a committee member stated that he thought gynecology was like dermatology. It was non-essential. To which the student replied that you won't die from pimples, but you can die from gynecological complications, which is true. And very few health centers, or I don't think any of them, provide those services. Campus safety is a major concern for female students, and it's also an accessibility issue. In 1984, Chancellor Wharton made a call for each campus to set up a women's safety task force. Each campus came up with a report on what needed to be done on their campus to make them safer. The reports were very specific as to what was needed to be done, from what trees should be cut down to where more lights were needed to be installed, or where blue light phones should be placed. It is now 6 years later, and less than 10% of these recommendations have been acted upon. With cuts to funding of maintenance, the already insufficient lighting on campuses will become even worse. Presence of public safety officers and the ability to reach them is also of great concern. A report done in the spring of 1989 of peace officer staffing found that with the exception of 5 of the 28 schools, officers have worked as the only person on patrol on a shift at places such as the University at Albany. Due to the $51 million cut that was given to SUNY in last December, 6 campuses have cut their public safety staff, and with the budget the way it is now, more campuses are sure to follow. Concerns for the safety has kept women from attending classes or using facilities such as the library or gym at night. The last point I really want to make is about childcare. It is an essential component to equal access of an education. The population of women students with children is continuing to grow. It is imperative that we have adequate and affordable childcare for these women so that they will be able to complete their education. Adequate childcare facilities is also essential for recruitment and retention of women faculty and staff. Without guaranteed subsidies, it is impossible to operate quality childcare centers on SUNY campuses. Last year, the legislature gave $100,000 specifically earmarked for SUNY childcare facilities. This year, the governor has not included this money in his budget. This change in funding affects SUNY's childcare facilities' ability to hire new staff to accommodate more children, or just to retain the staff that they have now. This becomes an access issue for many women students who need childcare in order to attend school. There's more to going to school than just tuition. It now costs a student 1/3 of their income to use the childcare facilities. With cuts in funding, there's sure to be an increase. And with that, you have mandatory fees, which aren't covered by financial aid. It's unfortunate that in this day and age, women still have to overcome the barriers to get an education. In the 1990s, women make up the majority of the students in the universities, but programs specifically designed to address women's issues and needs are considered special, when in reality, they are a permanent presence now and in the future.
My task force is planning to go on the campus safety issue to SUNY in Buffalo and SUNY in Purchase. So if you would like to focus some testimony at those two campuses, that's where we'll be in about 2 months. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending and staying, and we are going to be doing our utmost, as you are aware, and it's just very difficult for us, but knowing that we have your support is very helpful. Thank you for attending. And thank you, Senator Montgomery and Assemblywoman Weinstein.